Okay. So first of all, it's good to be back again after we missed a week. I guess I should give a special thank you and shout out to Rabbi who gave me a shout out in a shiur earlier this week on with regards to the topic that I want to discuss. So the topic I want to discuss, even though I'm sure you've been learning it, you heard shiur from Rabbi Shuchat, has to do with the inyan of Petzua daka, but I'm going to try to approach it from an interesting angle. So Petzua daka, as we know, the basic, I'm going to go through some of the basic makayos in a second, but we know Petzua daka is someone who has some kind of injury in their reproductive organs, and that makes, according to the Torah, one of the lavim, one of the leisa says in the Torah, the pashat is, lo yove Petzua daka bekal Hashem, they cannot marry. So if Even Ezer, Simon Hay is, the beginning of Even Ezer is going through the checklist. Someone comes to marry, you want to know, are they allowed to marry? Are they mutter love bakal? So this is one of the things you have to ask along the way. But as we shall see, the details, and specifically how a certain major halacha, seemingly Petzua daka, how it fits the science, how it fits the metzias, is actually a major question that we will get into. There are some sides, parenthetical points that I could mention along the way. Of course, I think Rabbi had also mentioned, there's the famous question of the spelling of daka with an aleph, daka with a hey. It could be its own interesting discussion, but that's not directly negated to this. Another stylistic note, there's this question of pronunciation of the word Petzua versus Bea. So some people go to one extreme, and Maseches Bea, everything is pronounced that way. Some people say forget it. Even in their own casual conversation, they use the word with a tzaddik in every situation, so it doesn't matter if they're learning. I always found the whole Zehirus interesting. We're going to talk about what's the pshat, if the way people understand it, that it's either all or nothing, that it's across the board or never mind. What's taka the pshat? Why would you want to avoid saying the word stamazeh when you're talking about Maseches Bea? So already for many years I've argued, I don't know if it's 100% proven, nice gehalten, but that melchatchila, the vart was always that it's only a zehir, it's only a sensitivity when you're speaking in this context, when you're speaking about human anatomy. Then there's an art to be nizar in how one speaks, because we see how people in casual conversation will use that part of the body sometimes in a joking way, and they throw the word around. And we know in English, in every language, there's expressions that are based on it. Yener hot, yener hot nisht, so there's a culture of being not very polite in that context. So with regards to that, it makes sense there should be a zehiris, not to be so coarse. So it makes sense with regards to that, with reference to that. So to me, it always made sense to say that the whole zehiris taka only applies in this context, and not when we're talking about Beitza Shenel L'Yamtiv. So personally, that's kind of the distinction that I've gone with. So for the purposes of this discussion, I will say it the way whoever the marshal that says that there's a zehiris. Anyway, so there are different terms, as we shall see. There's confusion among the terms. We're talking about Petzua daka. There's a more general term in Lashon HaKodesh, asaris, someone who can't have children, usually often has something to do with injuries to their reproductive organs. And of course, the concept of asaris has its own interesting history. There's a non-Torah article called, an article on the topic of the history of essentially what we're going to discuss, and nitl habeya or nitl habeim, the removal, or the technical English term for it is an orchidectomy, apparently. So there's an article that talks about the history, which is going to be negayah to something that we're going to get to shortly. But in the course of explaining that point, which I'll get to, gives a broader history, right? So starts with Tanakh, Taka and Tanakh. You have in Sefer Vayikra, Merayach Oshech. So there's that reference to Kehanim, and that being a mum, if they have a problem there. Then you have the other pasuk in Dvarim about Petzua daka. Then, of course, you have the word saris many times throughout Tanakh. Saris not referring to it in a halachic context, but just as a cultural thing that within the culture, people looked around, there are certain people that were identified, that person is a saris. So what exactly does that mean? So it implies that there's something different about their reproductive organs, perhaps that something was done to them on purpose. We get the sense from Megillas Esther, from other places that Sarisei HaMelech, that the royal courts tended to have people like this, and it seems to have been done b'kavana, right? So commonly, typically, the way it's said is that, you see specifically, especially Megillas Esther, where the Sarisim are involved with the Beis HaNoshim, so the assumption is that perhaps they did it deliberately because the royals have so many Noshim and Pilagshim, so to avoid extra unnecessary drama, so either you go and you completely remove all of their organs, so the Bechlal, they can't chep and Heb Zachan, or perhaps you leave the main part, but you remove the ability to have children. So you want to fool around, that's Einzach, but at least it won't cause problems with illegitimate children. So that's some of the context you see when it comes to that history. And Sadisim are mentioned in Mitzrayim, in Sefer Bereshis, and even by the kings of Yehuda and Yisrael, you see in Sefer Malachim and Sefer Divrei Yama mentions Sarisim. We don't always know. Is that every time it says a Saris, does the taka mean that they were Nistaris, or does Saris sometimes just mean Sarisim just means the officials? Maybe it's not 100% clear, but you do see the term used a lot. Of course, Megillas Esther, Shashka, Saris HaMelech, Shemer HaNoshim, Shemer HaPilagshim. The Christians have their own relationship with that. Historically, there were some Christians or some Gehalten that you have to go all the way, and they were Messiahs themselves, but that's apparently not considered mainstream. Anyway, that's Lahavdil. In ancient Rome, we know a lot about ancient Rome, aside from Chazal, aside from it's already documented history. And apparently in Rome, they actually differentiated between different sarisim and what exactly happened to them to make them a saris. So it says there's one term for those that their private parts were pressed, another term for those that were crushed, another for those that were removed, which taka corresponds to those psukim, which refers to different scenarios. So you see that even though Rome is much later than the psukim, but you see this awareness and distinction between different sorts of sarisim and different sorts of petzua daka, essentially. And then the role and the context that sarisim had. And then, in China practiced this till very, very recently. As long as there were kings in China, apparently almost still 120 years ago, they still had sarisim. It was still a thing that was done. There's documentation, even photographs of sarisim in China from 100 and something years ago. And then, of course, in Italy, you had the singers, the castrati, that also somehow ended up without this part of their body, and it affected their voice. I guess it happened to them at a young age, so they never, went through puberty properly, whatever the case may be, and the quality of their voice was considered to be different. And someone just sent me that there's a recording, there's one recording of the last Italian castrati. You could actually hear what someone like that sounded like. So some of this history is actually, in a way, fairly recent. Like I'm saying, here in China, here in Italy, you could still see some of these older musagim of what a basar saris is. And of course, today, you hear it in contexts where someone commits terrible crimes, and people say, you know what they should do to this guy? You hear people still bring it up, and I think it was the end of 2 years ago, I gave a shiur about Shaila that the father of all the shachats, Rav Dovid Yehuda Shachat, who was a Rav in Basel, he sent a Shaila to a number of Rabbanim about someone who was mamish in Basel, who was mamish a pest, mamish a predator, and he was just assaulting people nonstop, children. It was a terrible situation. And the ungenumene practice at the time in Northern Europe or whatever was to actually go through with castration. So that is also something, an example of how this was used and implemented in a more modern context of how to deal with someone as a bride. Obviously, more recently, in the context that we probably spoke about it more here, is the medical context in which people have different medical issues which lead to something happening in that area. But just to have a broader concept of what we're talking about. And Petzua daka is coming from a context either of random injuries or random birth defects, or perhaps some of these cultures where there were Messiahs people for different reasons. But I'm going to still going to need this later to discuss another example of being Messiahs that's going to be negated to our discussion. So now I want to go through some of the basic Makairis, because as we shall see, once we get to the discussion, there's some confusion among the Achreinim. So just to make sure, even though I'm sure most of you or all of you have more or less gone through the Makairis, but let's just take a look for a second. So the first Makar after the Pasuk, of course, is in Perek in Yevamis, Perek Ches, Perek Ha'arol. And the context is, who can eat truma, who can't eat truma, so then it goes from there into Petzua, daka, chrus, shavcha, the people with these injuries, hein mavadei and yechelu, so if they're a kayan, they could eat truma, they're avadim who belong to them, so they can also eat truma, nishayhen lo yechelu. The wives, so interestingly, we're assuming they have wives, the wives shouldn't eat. So, Zakt Bevadim Bar Tanura, why? Because he's a Kohen, and she's an Ashes Kohen, but they weren't supposed to be married, and he wasn't supposed to be with her. That's Layavai. And he's a Kohen, so the Shavi Chalala B'viyasai. To Nivala Pasala, she becomes a Chalala from that interaction. So now, she's a Chalala, she can't eat Truma. Ve'im lo yida'ah mishanasa Petzua daka chrus shavcha. And what if they weren't together from when he became a Petzua daka? It's interesting, the Mishnah is also acknowledging a concept where maybe he was married first and then he became a Petzua daka. The way that Rav says, and it's assuming they're still somehow married, but they're avoiding this isser of being ba'ala. So then they could eat. So it's all pasha din on whether they were together or not. And the Rambam writes, in the Pirush Mishnah, Petzua daka, chrus shavcha, bilos and bi'ilaz nus. So even if they're able to do a bi'ila, because it's just a Petzua daka, but they shouldn't, it's a bi'ilaz nus. From there, the Mishnah goes into discussing, that was the context in Yevamis, was talking about Kehanim, and then these types of this discussion. From there it goes into this general question. Eizu Petzua daka. Kol shenifzu habayim shaloi va'afilu achas mehen. So, if his bayim are injured, including if only one was injured. This is going to be very important. This is going to be the big discussion. Then it goes on to say, they can marry the types of people that a mamzer can marry. They just can't be baba kol as a regular person. So, some information here, not a clear picture. The Rambam in Sefer Kedusha, Chosesor Rebia, Perek Tazayin, goes into greater length, summing up the sugyas, fi shitasai. As we'll see, he has a certain shita and certain pratim that other Rishonim disagree with. He says, Petzua daka, shenasu bas Yisrael, ubalu, leiken, you get malchus, shenem aliyavet, Petzua daka, chus shavcha. So they're able to do a beila, but they shouldn't. And they can marry Geras Meshachreres. And even a Kain who's a Petzua daka can marry Geras Meshachreres, she'enu b'ktushasai, etc. Eizu Petzua daka, kol shenifzu habayim shaloi. And then he goes into the details. Nichnesu habayim, hayachad mehen. So the Mishnah only mentioned, I believe, Petzua. Here the Rambam starts going through different scenarios. Nichnesu habayim, hayachas mehen, so if they were completely cut. Shenifza, injured, achas mehen. Shenidoicha, crushed, shechasera, it's missing. Shenikva, it's a hole, etc. Harez apostle. These are all variations, varieties of Petzua daka. Also, if nichnesu chutei habayim, oy achad mehen, oy sheniduch, oy nifza, harez apostle. So there are many, many different scenarios. Any injury, essentially, to even one of them is a Petzua daka. Then the Rambam says that all of this is shaloi hayu b'dei shemayim. If someone went and cut it, or the dog, or it's an accident, but if noilad Petzua daka, or shenoilad b'loi bayim, Or even if he had them and then he had an illness on his own and he lost it, or the Shchin, etc. So there's some kind of exception if it's all bidei shemayim, in which the Rambam includes if there was a chayli. So you have the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah signed to the Gemara. We're going to try not to get too into the weeds with the different sugyas. But he mentions that there's Shmo b'nei shel b'yechim b'reika says Shamaytu b'chachamim b'kan b'yavna kol she'ein li ela beya achas ein li ela k'sidis chama v'kosher. So what does that mean exactly? Because we keep on saying even beya achas is a Petzua daka, and also he's equating it. He's using the word. We didn't use the word saris until now. Here he's using the word interchangeably with saris and el k'sidis chama. So Zok the Kesef Mishnah that one mahalach of teaching it is that this is the mark of the bidei shemayim. The idea that if it's bidei shemayim, chasera be'achas bidei shemayim, then he's kosher. V'hu adin l'shtein, the taka was nothing to do with one or two, but just chasser legamrei lo shchiach. It's not a shchiach to be missing two. So he angechapt one, but the var wasn't the one or the two. The var was the bidei shemayim, and that's where the Rambam got this din of bidei shemayim. And there's also a Fedish Mem and Amr Shmuel Petzua daka b'dei shemayim kosher. So these different memories in Gemara, and the question is how you put them together, and that's how the Rambam is doing it per the Kesef Mishnah. So if you pay attention, if you're noticing, none of these Mekayres, the Mishnah, the Rambam, they never really ever fully address the vart of being able to have children, not being able to have children, but it sort of seems implied, and you see these casual references to Asaris. And historically, as like I said, that's the context. When you talk about Asaris, that's what they did to many Sarisim. They just were Pegeya, Petzua, they're Bayim. So, but it's never ever fully spelled out clearly. Kum Taisvis and Yavamis, on this line from that we just quoted before from the Gemara, She'en li ala beya achas. So fragt Taisvis, unlike the Taich the Kesef Mishnah brothers, you said Ein Ela Be'achas Achas kosher, but I thought we have everywhere else it says that even Kol Sheniftu Be'afil Achas Mehen. So what's this idea of one? And then the Taisa throws in a kasha. Oi, to be the Adam Nami, try to make a distinction between the Adam Nami, be the Adam Nami, Hachazinon, Kama B'nei Adam Shekarsen Mehen Be'a Achas Umelidin. Taisa says we see that many people had one cut off, doesn't say why, but that they had one cut off, and they're still able to have children. So Taisa for the first time is throwing in a Shaila from the Metzias. And Tosis is asserting that the Metzias is that actually we've seen many people that lost one and were able to have children. It doesn't make sense to say that, we have to suspect and accuse all of them as where their children really come from. But Amar Rabbeinu Tam, the Yesh L'chalek Bein Nitla Habeya L'Petzia. The Lashon, whenever it said Afilu Be'achas, see the Rambam put it all together and said that when the Mishnah says nifza, when the pasuk says nifza, it includes nichras, this. He says, no, the pasuk says petzua, the Mishnah says nifza. Zakta bein atam, ish l'chalek bein nitla lepetzia. If you just go and remove one entirely, moiled. And he gives an equation, he equates it with terefis by tchoil, the spleen, that if nitla tchoil ksheda, but if the tchoil is injured, then it's trefa. So you could see this concept that having none is better than having an injured one. The Gemara also mentions nichrasu. No, when the Gemara said nichrasu, it only referred to both. But if nichras achas kosher. So that's Rabbeinu Tam's original take on the Gemara. Then it brings in a Yerushalmi. There's a Yerushalmi that also mentions Im Yovei Lefonai Bal Be'ah Achas Ani Machshiroi. And then another Almeida says Uvad Shleiman. What's Shleiman? Kum Turi and says, you know what? I don't think it says Shleiman. I think it's really Shel Yamin. We know that in Rambam and earlier spellings, the Shin Lamed was attached to the word. The Shel was attached to the next word. Shel. So it's not Shleiman, it's Shel Yamin. So Ibazoi, the Ri is Machadish that, I can accept Rabbeinu Tam's vart in theory that maybe having one is okay, but only If you have the shel yamin and they remove the shel smoil, but if you have the shel smoil and they remove the shel yamin, then weiter. It says in Taisus chumra gedola, but toiv lahazer hareifim l'reifim lachtach shel smoilim afsher. So the Taisus is already referring to some kind of metzias where doctors were doing this, and that's why I was referring to chazin and kama b'nei adam shekarsim and be'ah achas u'me'elidin. Talking about the reifim, and Taisus is concluding and saying that we should be machmer. If we're going to go with Rabbeinu Tam, should be machmal agri and tell the reifim lachtach shel smoilim after. So we're going to get to in a bit who were these reifim, what were they doing, and why were they doing it? Okay, so now we have now Rabbeinu Tam Taisus is introduced to some additional confusion here now about the metzias. What is the metzias, and how does that metzias fit with this halacha? And certainly the sugyas themselves are very unclear on this. You have Abavin, you have Yerushalmi, are they saying the same thing? Are they saying different things? And like I said, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the sugyas, so we're going to try to discuss it without getting too deep into those. Moving on to Shulchan Aruch, so Siman Hey, you learn Siv Beis, Ezu Petzua daka, Kol Shenifzu, Habeim Shalai, etc., etc. So the Beis Shmuel comments there and says, by the way, he comes and spells it out. He says, the whole point is that he's becheskas, that he can't have children. Again, the assumption here is vital that the person was not married yet, and he came to marry, and he wasn't supposed to marry. So it's mashma dem badim amzeirim, ken kasav amardchai, v'asmag, v'atur. Ben Yerucham says in one of the scenarios that it's a suffix. There's another question if there's a refuah. Is there a potential for refuah? Some places seem to think there's no refuah for chus shavcha. But in Shas, sometimes it implies that there is a refuah for some of these things. And he says, and he concludes, Nirem hoylid leitalina shenesrape, elam can be a dua shenesrape. So the assumption is, if you have any of these things as described in halacha, including Papashtas, nitl be'a achas, can't have children. If there are children, it's either Banav Ramzainim, you don't assume that it was Nesrape. Could be there's a potential to be Nesrape, but he has to come and prove that he was somehow Nesrape. That would only be if, somehow it's just Nika Vinistam, you're able to fix whatever was bad. Now Siv Zayin. So now what about Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam? These are these two interesting shittas. So Siv Zayin, Mechaber doesn't even give Rabbeinu Tam the light of day, doesn't give him airtime. Nichresu habeim ayachas mehen, ayishenivtza achas mehen, ayishenidoicha achas mehen, ayishechaser, ayishenikva, pil oshna the Rambam, harei apostle. The end. Come to Ramah, and Ramah says, v'chein iker, u'deloike yesh matirim ba'al beya achas, im hoisa oisa shnitla shlema kishenitla. Not those that are matter when you have one, if they taka, the one that removed was complete. Because that was Rabbeinu Tam's whole vart, that if it's complete and they remove it, then it's fine. And he throws in the requirement for Vri that has to be dafka the shel yamin, that remains. The Rama says, but Lamaisa, right? Taisus already is testifying to the fact that people are doing this. So someone quotes a Sefer HaTruma. Sefer HaTruma says that everyone's relying on Rabbeinu Tam. The Rama also says, true to his day, I see they're being mekel kasvara achreina, so something with doctors is still going on. Aval toiv lachash be'isr de'irayis al divin ha'machminim be'him raiv minyan v'raiv binyan. So the Rama says, no, it's isr de'irayis, what are you talking about? V'yova b'kal Hashem. When it comes to marriage and usr, people that are not allowed to get married, you're supposed to take it very seriously. It's not something to joke around with, not to take lightly. And he uses this lashon be'him raiv minyan v'raiv binyan, that Rabbeinu Tam is going up against everyone. Unusual lashon for the Rama. Then in Siv Yud, the Mechaber gets to this inyan of B'dei Shemayim. It's called Pisul, it's Kshloi B'dei Shemayim. But if the Oisha Chala includes Oisha Chala, he had an illness, unusual for the Mechaber to throw in names. He does it every once in a while. Usually that means that something's up. He says, then all of them are Kosh Leva B'Kal. Rashi v'Rosh, Lemik B'dei Shemayim, unless it's Mamish Mim'ei Ima, or Mamish Mim'Shemayim B'dei Chayli, Choshev B'dei Od M'Posel, because of Rosh, Tahachi, Mashma B'Yerushalmi. Okay, so we're trying to mainly ignoring Rabbeinu Tam, certainly ignoring the whole question of that Rabbeinu Tam already raised, that aren't they giving birth to children? Garnish, Shulchan Aruch, as if like it's still with the Rambam, still with the Gemara, it's avoiding this whole discussion. Now this question only got bigger and stronger no matter whether Shulchan Aruch addressed it or not, including scenarios in which people became a Petzua daka after they got married. And as we shall see, this actually turned into this huge Torah and science question in this case I'm going to talk about from the early 1700s. So that's why I want to talk about it. I think it's very interesting to see how this whole mitzvah, this whole aveda, this whole halacha is seemingly pashat not adding up and computing properly in light of what we know about the Metzias, and this is a question that just got stronger over time. And ultimately, if you are mekel, that means you're essentially paskening what looks like hepech b'feidish Mishnah, which is also always an interesting thing. And b'chlal, like Rabbi said, are we treating this the same way we treat an Eishes Ish, a mamzer? Certain mamzer situations, we try to be mekel. If the details in the situation are unclear, we can try to be mekel. But if things are clear, we tend to get very worked up about trying to prevent mamzerim from marrying. No, so is Petzua daka being treated the same way? Is being treated differently? So this brings us to the kuntres igeres bikaires. Kuntres igeres bikaires is a little known kuntres printed by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. I'm assuming all of you have heard to one extent or another of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Yaakov Emden was born around the time of the Baal Shem Tov, Tafnun Ches, and he outlived the Baal Shem Tov, he outlived the Maggid, he passed away a few years after the Maggid in Taf Kuf Lamed Vav. So that's just to give you a sense of the time. Although he lived further off, he lived in Germany for many years in Hamburg, the Kehilas Ahu. And we know Rabbi Yaakov Emden was involved in many controversies, especially the major one that had to do with accusing people of being sympathetic to Shabbat Tzvi. And Yaakov Emden printed many Kunteresim and Pashkavilin, and if you go and dig them up, you can have a fun time, very entertaining. And Yaakov Emden wouldn't mince words, he wouldn't hold back, he would say exactly what he thought. And he would lace into an attack from people that are considered to be Gedali Hadar back then, till today. But people said this is Rabbi Yaakov Emden's first Pashkavil, Rabbi Yaakov Emden's first kuntres before he got into the whole Shabtai Tzvi thing. His first kuntres is about Petzua daka. And all these, many years ago, I remember noticing, I went to HebrewBooks.org and I put in Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Geras Bikairis, Petzua daka, what's going on over there? Oh, so now here's our opportunity to find out what's going on in this lesser known kuntres. And once you take a look, you see it's actually just as interesting as all his later kunteresim and other topics. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden lived in Hamburg at this time. This is originally the Tuf Tzaddik, so the 1730s. Germany, the Pashtus had a somewhat better medical profession, perhaps, than Eastern Europe, Poland, and Russia. They had more of a tradition of surgery. Well, surgeries had been around forever. Obviously, there's different, the history of surgery, the history of modern medicine, there's different phases and stages. We know that ancient medicine was basically holding strong till around the 1500s, perhaps. And from the 1500s and on, that's when there were some major new discoveries, and that's when they started questioning things and testing things and having new theories, etc., and things are moving slowly along. But by the time you get to 1700s, you're starting to see the beginnings, perhaps, of what looks like modern medicine today. And this whole discussion is about a surgery, and from that we'll also understand some of what was going on even earlier in the Middle Ages. So the kuntres is called Igeres Bikairis. He printed it. Yaakov Emden famously had his own printing press, and that allowed him to print whatever he wanted, whether it was legally or illegally. Sometimes you see he seems to fake the location. They put like the fake location on the bottom in big letters, so it looks like it was printed somewhere else. He does that here. He writes Bekushta Dina, which is a pun on Kostandina, but he's using the Aramaic of Kushta and Dina. So, but you see he puts it in big letters sort of to throw off the scent. So he printed this at the time of this controversy in the 1730s, and again, many years later, when he was older, in the 1760s. With Hysafis. So what happened here in this Igeres Bikairis? So he says the Igeres Bikairis is here to make a seder and the ganze sugya of Saris and Petzua and Nichras. But then there's another paragraph just on the Sharabah to give you an idea of how interesting this kuntres is. He says, Gam kalulim boy Kama gedolim ma'asav and afloyos neiros. That Hashem can change the teva and Hashem's hashgacha even in these dairas. And we see how Chazal are right when they say things that seem strange, that the Chacham Beineim are laughing at. And now we see, for example, Behiroyan Besula V'ish lo yada. Girl became pregnant without being with a man. Where Chazal say things that seem strange, and even Misnagdenu are admitting that things are true. So there's a whole another dimension going on here, where he's also making the argument that today we have certain lecturers that's their whole kav, that's their whole derech, talking about Chazal and stuff, and that Chazal knew the truth. So Yaakov Emden is doing a version of that somehow in this Kuntres on Petzua daka. So thanks to him, he actually preserved not only his own take, but he preserved all the documents that relate to it. So thanks to him. It begins like this. It's a shayla to the Rav of Hamburg. Back then there wasn't a Rav most of his life. He was only a Rav in the city of Emden, Taka, for a few years. That's where he got the nickname Emden from. He actually wasn't happy about that nickname, and he sort of asked people to stop using it. Obviously, it's still pretty popular, although he signed his name Yavitz. People call him the Yavitz. Yaakov ben Tzvi. But otherwise, he wasn't the Rav. He was the person that made the Rav's life miserable. That was more his type. So in this case, he's also doing a bit of that, although not too extreme. So the Rav in Hamburg at the time is Chesed Katzenellenbogen. Chesed Katzenellenbogen is 30, 40 years older than him, so showing an elder Rav. And he was asked the following question. He was asked about someone that had a chayli, shebeya yamanis shaloi ba b'teicha chayli shel sakana shekoinin kalte brand. He has an illness called kalte brand, and the Reifim decided they have to amputate, they have to cut it, they have to remove it, because habeya mechula, that's already getting eaten up. And they were concerned that the kalte brand shouldn't spread to the second beya. B'chol gufei sakanas nefashos. This person was already married. Yesh ishu banim. So imchayev lifresh oisay kedin petzua daka. So does that mean that after he had the surgery that we have to be mafresh him from his wife kedin petzua daka? Now what is kalte brand? So I looked around to see if anybody explains properly what kalte brand is. I found that someone wrote an article a few years ago about the decision to amputate in early modern Germany. So that's really the context there, is how people went about deciding to go ahead with an amputation in a case like this. But along the way, she explains that there's Heisse Brand and Kalte Brand. Brand in German is fire. You see it in Brandwand as a firewall. Brandwein is Yain Soraf. So Heisse Brand means hot fire. Kalte Brand means cold fire. What's pshat? So when you look through the writings, there are a lot of medical writings from throughout the years. So apparently, Heisse Brand, they're both referring to some kind of infection spreading through the body. Heisse Brand is when it's gangrenous, when there's infection spreading, but the skin is turning red, it's getting infected, it's warm to the touch. Kalte, so that's why it was called the hot fire. Kalte Brand is after that, and I guess nowadays we probably wouldn't allow it to get that far, but back then things would get that far, and that's when it starts turning black and blue, and it's cold to the touch, essentially dead, but still attached to the person. That was a term that was used, kalte brand, the cold fire, which also spreads and is even worse. And usually when you have kalte brand, that meant you have to amputate as soon as possible. Hopefully it's still distant from the more sensitive parts of the body. And so here the person had the kalte brand already in a pretty sensitive part of the body, and it's close to the rest of the body. So that's what was happening here. So B'chasel Katzenellenbogen is essentially being asked this question. They removed one. What's the din if you remove one? So it begins by quoting Shulchan Aruch Siman Hey, Das Reiv Paiskim, Pasul B'nechtach Be'achas. Ramah says, maybe if the initial Yaman is kosher, B'netam Ri, Toiv L'Hachmer. The question is, can we say that this is a case of chayli? And weiter, most poskim say that it's no good, that these Petzua daka, but the Rambam, and whoever agrees with the Rambam is matir. And some want to paskin like the Rambam. The question is also, is the Rambam even talking about a case like this? Because here, ultimately, the doctors then amputated, doctors then removed it. So would that even count as what the Rambam was talking about, or not? That's part of the question. He wants to say no. In this case, it was in such bad shape before that lefi the Rambam, it would zicher be considered as if he already lost it. Now the doctors just went ahead and removed the thing that was completely dead. So it should be called chayli according to the Rambam. So that goes into a pilpul. And then he tries to essentially say that there's already precedent. He quotes some tshuvas before him. They also were dealing with these questions. He wants to say that you have Rabbeinu Tam on the one hand. He has one, so Rabbeinu Tam says that it's fine. And you have the Rambam, because it was kal tebrand, so they had to remove it anyway. So between the Rabbeinu Tam and between the Rambam, yesh letzad lahatir, that lebal lechafais, we're not going to force him legadish or lifresh. And we're connected, we're going to use a Rambam, we're going to use Rabbeinu Tam, even though each is a yachid, but we should tell them that, look, it's taka shaila, it's not so pasha, mechnisin is atzmon, besafik isser deraisa, we told the couple that, it's on them, but if they don't care, we're not going to force them to do anything. But then Rabbi Cheskel says, Miya noichi umani, who am I? Isser lav deraisa, so I want other lumdim in our kehillah to get on board. So who does he mean by lumdim in his kehillah? So the next shuvah we have is from someone by the name of Reb Shamshin Blach, or Reb Shamshin Chassid. And he's the author of the Tosfos Chadashim and Mishnayos. If you're looking at Vilna Mishnayos, you see Tosfos Chadashim. I remember seeing it. I never thought about who the author is too much. It was this Reb Shamshin Blach. He was not a Rav. He had what was called a Klois. Klois was, I guess, the precursor to a Kolel. And that they sat and learned for years, and that was it. It was not, no practical shtela. And apparently he was a very original thinker. So come to the Shamshin Blach, and he says, so first he wrote hasagas, 10 hasagas, responding to the way Rabbi Cheskel wrote, and then he wrote his own shuvah. We'll skip the hasagas, let's just go to his shuvah. He says, I was asked as well, what's the case? They took his right one. Can be matter his wife, or does he have to be megadisher? So he starts going through, you have this Gemara, you have the Rambam, you have Rabbeinu Tam. He wants to argue very strongly that the Rambam, even Beferish, holds that if the doctor felt the need to cut it, that would also count as part of chayli. Never mind that in this case it was already completely lost, so it was chayli to begin with, that that part of his body was lost. And then you have Rabbeinu Tam, and besides quoting them, he's also sort of leaning towards them, saying, yeah, each one's verstand in the sugya taka makes a lot of sense, and a lot of different Vishayim agree with them. Sometimes it's in the presentation, but that's how he's presenting it. And then he goes into this, and he says, Gam b'dereinu, and he makes a whole trask out of it in his tshuva. Gam b'dereinu, hareifim, the kama b'nei adam idim sheyuchal lahoylid. So he, was also didn't really get into that question that Rabbeinu Tam raised. Shamshin Blach, Mamash takes it head on. He says the Reifim and people, everyone says that they can have children. And he says, I spoke to a Reif Echad Mumcha Mefarsim. He was 83 years old, which I guess is taka big zaken for those days, but he had a lot of experience. And he told me the fitumai. I was schmoozing with him. I didn't tell him why I'm asking. I just chatted him up, and I started schmoozing about this topic, this question. And I was talking about other things, and I brought the conversation to this, and he told me that he dealt with 100 patients. Some were Nimoilim, some were Arelim, and he's done this procedure that we're discussing here. And he said that he doesn't always have to remove the beya. Depends on the makkah. Also depends if you want to completely heal your problem or not. If you want a temporary refuah, you could do it without. But regardless of what he did, he says, Kulam halidu achar. He told me, there was a guy, an usher, and he hirba betashmish until he had a kilkul on the bayim, and they removed one, and then he continued, and he had many more children from multiple women. Beautiful. Mashenke, when he removed two, then loyoilid, and the hair fell out, and the voice changed, so I guess maybe perhaps even after puberty. But be'achas, he said, lo nishtana b'shum davar. So why? Because when you remove one, so you just close up one, so everything transfers to the other one. You have kayach kiflayim. That's what this doctor claimed. I actually looked it up, wanted to know, because Slavdavka, either side over here is medicine and medicinal knowledge is correct. There was actually a study in 1991, comparative study of the fertility potential of men with only one testes, and apparently the bottom line is that there is a considerable decrease in fertility potential, but of course they could have children, but it is less. So what that doctor claimed was also going a little too far. So he says, aha, so if this is the Metzias, so then we have to touch right into the Gemaras, we have to touch right into the Sugyas. Sir, otherwise, how does anything make sense here, Batsim? And he told me there's no difference between right and left. He says, how can we be machish the chush? Is the famous Rashba, when it comes to treifus, this question came up with treifus. Chazal say all kinds of things are treifus, which means it's a literal statement, they won't live. Zemir b'muchash, if you see b'poyal mamish, that they do live. So Rashba famously said, we don't talk about it, we don't ask any questions, we stick to whatever Chazal said. If Chazal say treifa, no questions asked. So isn't that the precedent? He says, no. That's the Rashba, he said it over there. He says clearly, we are trying to make everything fit with what the Reifim are saying. He says that's Pshat in the Rambam. The Rambam said what he said, that had to do with that, as he saw that they were having children. How that fits into the Rambam exactly, and somebody should say sometimes that we should rely on the Rambam in these cases, but he's Migdali HaReifim. And they have Rabbi Tam, so between Rambam and Rabbi Tam, the Ramah, not the Ramah here, there's the Ramah in Siman Gimel, that when we mentioned at the beginning of the year, I was talking about period of Redivia, that we don't force people anymore to divorce for period of Redivia, or to marry for period of Redivia. So we leave people, we don't meddle into this aspect of people's lives so much anymore. And then he says that I know people here in Hamburg, there are people that they had one removed and they had children afterwards. I said, I called them and I spoke to them and they told me their story, how they were a kid. So what's the context there? And we're going to have to pause. The context is hernias. So in this article about the history of orchidectomy, it says that the inguinoscrotal hernia, which means many hernias. A hernia is something the kishkis fall out of place. The question is where they fall out of place. So for many people, they fall taka into that area of the groin, the Mekayma kiss. So a lot of people had hernias amal. So we know amal back in Russia, they wore kilobendel, so they schlepped around for the rest of their lives. They never actually healed it. But for actually hundreds of years, taka going back to the time of Rabbeinu Tam, the Reifim were healing these inguinoscrotal hernias by opening the kiss, removing one of the bayim, and then sticking the stomach back in or whatever, sewing it up, and baita gefarin. So that is what Rabbeinu Tam was talking about. Rabbeinu Tam was saying that they're moiled. And now Reb Shimshon Blach is doing that same thing again. He's doing his own research, and he's saying, this one had one, and this one had one. He's going through and bringing examples. And here in this article it says that, quotes a doctor from the 1300s that says, a satisfactory herniotomy cannot be performed without castration. It was considered a davar pashat to the doctors in Europe in the Middle Ages, that if you want to heal the hernia, like he was quoting the doctor before, you don't want to just hold it in place. You want to heal it, it involves removing. And this was like a davar pashat for hundreds and hundreds of years, and some tried healing it with skipping it and never seemed to work. And then this article says, surgical practice then became split between the academic surgeons, who based their practice on anatomical knowledge and tried to develop new surgical techniques, failing which they controlled herniae with trusses, so they stopped doing it. They stopped doing the surgery. They felt it was ridiculous, so you have to hold it in place. But then you had the gelders. The gelders were people, it's a word in English for people, literally that's their inyan, that they castrate. The gelders continued to castrate many children and adults in the course of repairing their rupture. And then finally, as time went on, people started getting fed up and said, what are you doing? What's going on over here? It finally ended in the late 18th century. The end of the 1700s, it finally ended. But this is going on from the 1200s, I guess, whenever, I didn't look up the exact date of Rabbeinu Tam, 1200s Barach, through the end of the 1700s, past Rabbi Yaakov and past this whole controversy, there were still, every time someone had a hernia in this area, the doctors opened them up, and this in Germany, where they had somewhat supposedly better medical care. I'm assuming, like I said, in Eastern Europe, there's probably less of that. But anyway, so Shimshon Blach, on the one hand, is embracing science and saying they're yachal ha'ilud, which apparently seems to be true. On the other hand, he's also embracing the idea that you have to do, this is the surgery that you have to do. So he's saying, why we're having this whole argument about this guy that kalte brand, which is much more unusual. What about all the hundreds of Yidden that have been getting this procedure for all these years? No one's talking about them. You're going to be machmir on this guy. What about everyone else? They were married, they got married afterwards, they were married before. So because of this, he made this dramatic argument that, like he said, you have to make the halacha come in line with what the doctors say. And Mamela, he says, if you're Zoyas, we'll pause here, can even proactively go and marry, because he has this whole argument that I'm making. But at the end of the day, if Itaka comes and asks what to do, it would be hard to say what to do. We don't have Giyaris. You really can marry Giyaris. But Giyaris, we don't have Giyaris in here. And Pirvidiv is a big mitzvah, and he can have children. And all the doctors say that they're able to have children. So, whatever. It's, tricky, but he's leaning towards saying it should be fine. And Bechlav, if someone has a hernia, and he wants to go to the doctor to have this procedure, and he asks, Al pi halacha, can I have this procedure? Should you be pashtus lefidus? You should be mater. On the other hand, is the procedure even necessary? Because it also can sometimes bring l'dei sakana. But on the other hand, once you actually do the procedure, then you're as good as new. So these are questions that are tzarachi, and he ends with these questions, but you see where he's leaning, and that was Reb Shimshon Blach. And this is what set Rabbi Yaakov Emden off to go completely the other way, sign halacha, sign metzias, and I guess we'll have to leave that for another time at Shabbos.